There's an old sermon illustration that I heard once where there was a guy who lived on the streets. He decided one Sunday morning that he wanted to go to church. So he packed up his backpack. He took with him everything that he had and he went to church. Now he rolled into one of the fancy churches in downtown and he went and he sat in a pew that was a little too close to the front. The pastor noticed him and came over to him. He saw that he had his bags with him and he asked him. He said, "We are so glad that you are here with us today, but this is the house of God. I want you to do me a favor, and if you decide to come back, I want you to ask God what you should wear to church and what is appropriate to wear in the house of God." You know, it's a question that I'm sure some of you all have even thought about asking me from time to time. And so the next week, the man was excited to come back to church. And he came back in with his bags and he was wearing all the clothes that he owned. The pastor walked up to him again and he said, "Sir, I remember you from last week, but I thought that I asked you to talk to God and to ask what was appropriate to wear in the house of God." The man said, "Well, I did ask God what I should wear here. And God said that he didn't know because he had never been to your church before." Now, that's a silly illustration, but it's one that we chuckle at, and it's one that even if we don't think it's funny, we get it. Because deep down, somewhere in our soul, or somewhere in our own experience, we know that what the story is telling us is true. It's true that the church has always been really good at excluding the people that Jesus went out of his way to include. The church has always been really good at telling people they need to look a certain way, act a certain way, dress a certain way, when instead Jesus went out and met people where they were. Now, if you're joining us for the first time today in this series, we've been talking about faith and justice and how our faith should play a role in different hot button issues facing our world today. We've talked about religion in schools, gun violence, and reproductive rights. And today we're going to shift to a little bit more of a broad topic, but an issue that affects people across the world every second of every day. And that is the topic of poverty. These numbers that I'm going to read are from 2023. And I'm going to start globally and then zoom in from there. Globally, there are 712 million people that live in extreme poverty. That is almost 1 in every 11 people live on less than $2.15 a day. Here in the U.S., 37.9 million people live in poverty. That's nearly 12% of the U.S. population. To narrow in a little more, our state, the state of Kentucky, defines poverty as a household of 3 people living under roughly $23,500 of income a year. We have 16.3% of our population living below that poverty line, with 11% of that being considered extreme poverty. Other numbers that jumped out to me were that 22% of our children in Kentucky are living in poverty. 12% of our senior population is living in poverty. 14.4% of our population is considered having food insecurities. And we have 35% of our population living in a household of 3 with less than $47,000 of income a year. That means that 35% of people in our state are one lost job, one unexpected thing away from falling under that poverty line. There are also 134,000 people who are paying more than 50% of their income on housing, which again means that we are one unexpected loss or event away from leading to foreclosure or to houselessness. Whether it is globally, nationally, or even locally, we have a significant number of people who are living in poverty or right on the cusp of it. Many of us are struggling every day to make ends meet, to provide, to earn enough to live a life that isn't constantly walking a tightrope trying to merely survive. So when we turn to Scripture and we look at how our faith may intersect with the issue of poverty, it becomes very overwhelming very quickly. You will quickly find that there are over 2,000 verses in Scripture that talk about the poor or poverty or justice for the poor. There were so many avenues about how to talk about this issue in terms of faith. At first, I thought about laying out the model of the early church and how they were a community built on redistributing all of their possessions so that no one had more or less than what they needed. I thought about telling one of the many stories of how Jesus went out of his way and helped someone in need. But instead, as I usually am, I was drawn to a far weirder story. A story found in Luke 16, and also a story that happens to be one of the few where it talks directly about hell. But don't worry, it'll be fine. Just bear with me. The story is called The Rich Man and Lazarus, and it goes, there was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen and lived in luxury every day. At his gate was laid a beggar named Lazarus, covered with sores and longing to eat what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs came and licked his sores. The time came when the beggar died, and the angels carried him to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried in Hades, where he was in torment. He looked up and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. So he called to him, Father Abraham, have pity on me and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, because I am in agony in this fire. But Abraham replied, Son, remember that in your lifetime you received your good things, while Lazarus received bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. And besides all this, between us and you is a great chasm has been set in place, so that those who want to go from here to you cannot, nor can anyone cross over from there to us. He answered, Then I beg you, Father, send Lazarus to my family, for I have 5 brothers. Let him warn them so that they will not also come to this place of torment. Abraham replied, They have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them. So in our story, we have a rich man and Lazarus. They both die and they end up in 2 very different places. The beggar Lazarus ends up at Abraham's side, and the rich man ends up in Hades, asking how he too might get to where Lazarus is. There are a couple of things that jump out to me immediately about this story. The first is that we know that the rich man is religious. He recognizes Abraham. He seems to understand the references to Moses and to the prophets. But despite that, he quickly learns that no amount of religion or religious study or perfect attendance at Sunday school or memorized scriptures, none of that helped him get to where he wanted to be. The second thing that jumped out to me was the detail we are given of the gate that the beggar slept. I'm sure that if the rich man had a gate, then he probably also had walls too. A wall that was probably doing its job well. A wall that was to keep the beggar outside and to keep the rich man safely on the inside. The problem with that wall, and with all walls, is that we didn't get to choose who exactly that wall kept out. I'm sure the rich man didn't know that although it was doing its job by keeping the beggar out, that it also unintentionally kept God out too. And finally, the third thing that jumped out to me about our story is that we get to meet a beggar named Lazarus. And then we meet a nameless and faceless rich man. So why don't we get the rich man's name? I think we don't get a name for this person because we already know his name, right? It's not too hard for us to imagine. His name is on stadiums, on corporations, on statues, on street signs. His name might be the name of someone that we know personally. His name might be our name. No matter what his name is, we are familiar with it. So Scripture doesn't need to tell us that information. Instead, Scripture gives us the name of the poor beggar, the name Lazarus, the name that literally means God heard and rescued. Scripture is telling us that although we may be very familiar with the names of the rich man, we seem to not be as familiar with the name of the person who is sleeping on the other side of the wall of us. Scripture is telling us that we may not know the names of the 712 million people in the world, or the 37.9 million people in the States, or the 16% of the people in our state who are poor and hurting and struggling just to get by. We may not know them, but make no mistake that Jesus does. And doesn't just know them, but knows them by name. And that is the point that I think our scripture is trying to make today. Shane Claiborne said, "The greatest tragedy of our time has never been that rich folks don't care about poor people. It's that rich folks don't know poor people. It's never been a question of if people really at a surface level care about the person who is struggling, or care about the idea that people are hungry or hurting or houseless. Of course they do. It would be concerning if people didn't care about the idea of what poverty is. No, instead, the question has always been more about how personal have you gotten with it? How intimately do you know the people who are struggling? Because when we can turn that tragedy around, we will know it because our conversations will start to shift. Our conversations will become a lot less about the meaningless stuff that we tend to assign value to. The questions stop being, can we afford a new HVAC system? And they become, people are dying because they have nothing to drink. The comments become a lot less about the music being too loud or too quiet, and become a lot more about how people are dying because they have nothing to eat. The arguments become a lot less about if the communion table is supposed to go here and not there. And instead, the arguments become, my friend that I have come to know has nowhere to go, nowhere to lay their head. What are we going to do about that? I think that's why in Matthew 25, one of the most popular scriptures in terms of helping people, we get this very specific imagery. Imagery says that I was thirsty and you gave me water. I was hungry, you gave me something to eat. I was a stranger, you invited me in. I was in prison, you visited me. I was sick, you cared for me. We get a visual of active words. We get a visual of doing. We don't get a visual of someone writing a check. We don't get a visual of someone delegating visits. And not because those things are inherently bad, but because we can't make a difference if we aren't willing to get involved with people. We can't make a difference if we aren't willing to show up for people. We can't make a difference if we aren't willing to make poverty personal, to be there, to have conversations, to get to know people by name, to be moved by people who are just as good of a person as me or as you, to care for people who are struggling every single day to survive. We can't do it if we aren't there. It's why Mother Teresa said that it is fashionable to talk about the poor, but it's not as fashionable to talk to the poor. It's why in our story from earlier, the beggar gets a name, but the rich man doesn't. Because if we aren't willing to spend time, we aren't actively looking for reasons and opportunities to hang out with people, if we aren't taking the time to learn that the man's name on the other side of the gate is Lazarus, then we might just be missing out on God too. I don't have a solution on how to solve poverty. I don't have a policy to look for in the upcoming elections. I don't have a way to get from where we are to where we want to be. I don't have any answers for any of it. All I know is that our story says if you care about the poor, you're doing it right. And if you don't, you're doing it wrong. All I know is that there are over 2,000 verses that say it is our job to care about people in poverty. All I know is that when we are trying to figure out how our political beliefs and affiliations cross with our faith, it is impossible to love our neighbor, to care about the poor, and still support policies that actively crush them. If you want to do that, then that's your right. But don't say that it's because Jesus would. Someone asked Mother Teresa once how she was able to do all that she had done for the world and all that she had done for the poor. And she simply answered, I started with one. If we want a better world, if we want better for our neighbors, for our friends, for our city, for our state, we have to be willing to start with one person. One person that you are willing to get personal with. One person that you are willing to learn by name, to really care about, to really get to know. And I hope that you go from this place and that you start with just one. And you are willing to begin to make poverty personal.